Okay, on the show today, Neil McKinlay. So Neil is someone that I actually did a meditation retreat a while back, embodied meditation teacher. Yeah, just like chatting to actually. So happy to have you on the show, Neil.
Lovely to be here, Mark. Nice to see you again.
And you're in Canada, and I'm in Porto. We're in Portugal. We've established that today.
Yes. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, which is making the news these days for floods and landslides.
It doesn't sound much fun. I hope you're safe with all that.
We are safe. Southern Vancouver Island seems to be doing okay.
Okay. How did you get there? Let's talk about your journey. Like, you're a meditation teacher. Is that fair to call you that? Is that a fair?
I think I'm comfortable with meditation teacher. Yeah.
How did you end up as a meditation teacher then? What was your journey like?
Well, I mean, I was a competitive swim coach, a competitive swimmer when I was a teenager. And we went away to a swim meet in Vancouver one weekend. And I think to save money, the way we were dealing with accommodations was the boys stayed in one big conference room in a hotel and the girls stayed in another big conference room. And there was a mom who kind of oversaw the girls. And the boys, we got the brand new groovy hippie assistant coach taking care of us. And late the Saturday night that we were in Vancouver for this meet, he decided to teach us how to meditate. And so he kept us up far later than he should have and taught us how to meditate. And I remember just thinking like, okay, this is cool. I like this. And it was something that I stayed with. I probably wasn't, in retrospect, meditating when I thought I was meditating for a great many years. I think basically I was closing my eyes and trying to feel groovy, but I was interested enough to keep at it in the way that I was keeping at it, to read some books. And then about 30 years ago, I started to work within the Shambhala community, which started to give this interest and this inspiration, some shape. And then 20 years ago, I started working with a community called Dharma Ocean, and it's there that my meditative attention was literally turned toward the body. And I started practicing the embodied style of meditation that I still practice today, that I teach today. And, that's kind of how I got here. And one of the interesting things for me is there's a thread through all of that. And that throughout all of this, I've really been interested in, and maybe it's because I learned to meditate in an in the world way, meaning within the context of competitive swimming. Maybe it's because I did a couple of really early retreats with Pema Chrodron that were kind of online retreats before there was an online, which was really interesting. But one of the things that's interested me throughout this is how do the teachings and practices and our everyday lives illuminate one another? How do they affect and enrich and reveal one another? How are the teachings reflected in our everyday lives? How are our everyday lives affected by the teachings and practices? And, this is where I am today. Those are the central questions of my practice as a student and my instruction as a teacher.
So let's start with defining terms. And we're going to ask some sort of seemingly simple questions, but I find when I have deep experienced guests like you, it's always great questions. So let's just start with what is meditation? Because years ago, people used to go, oh, I don't know, tell me. But now it seems like people think they know what meditation is. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. So what is meditation?
Yeah, I love that question. I had a friend who was a philosophy professor, and she used to do that all the time to me. Could you define your terms, Neil? And I think it's really helpful to define our terms, especially like you say, with words that we now say so often: meditation, embodiment. So what is meditation? Meditation is simply a practice of connection. It's a practice whereby we take our normally wandering attention and direct it somewhere. In embodied meditation, so I'm now defining embodied meditation as well. In embodied meditation, we take our normally wandering attention and direct it towards some aspect of embodied experience. There are other styles of practice where you direct your attention in other ways. But in an embodied meditation, you direct your attention towards embodied experience. And that act of direction is, I think, the common thread through all forms of meditation. We're directing our attention somewhere. that normally wandering attention somewhere.
Great. So normally our mind jumps around. I'm like, oh, there's a noise, oh, I can smell food. And in meditation, there's a deliberateness, just putting it somewhere. You know, it could be a candle flame or your thoughts, but and I just want to highlight something. You didn't say the body, you said embodied experience, right?
Yeah, I did.
So do you want to say why you said embodied experience, not the body?
Well, not long ago, I was redesigning my website. I was building a new website, and the designer I was working with was really great. And he used to always ask these probing questions about, you know, what I was doing and what I was offering and how we were putting this together. And one day he said to me, he said, you know, you mentioned embodiment a lot, embodied this, embodied that, you know, what do you mean by that term? And it was so interesting because I couldn't answer. I was like, I don't know what I mean by that term. And in the couple of years since then, I've really been looking into the question of embodiment and the question of body. And one of the things I noticed is, if we were talking 2 years ago, I would have been talking about the body. I would have said, direct your attention towards it, the body, not embodied experience. But one of the things I've noticed is that what I am working with when I'm working in an embodied way is actually far more open and inclusive than what we typically mean by the body. It's an umbrella term that includes this apparently bounded body, but it also includes, you know, the sense of connection and relatedness that I enjoy with the world through my senses. It also includes the sense of presence and a support, for instance, that I feel from the cosmic world in the form of the earth underneath. It's a far more inclusive term that I feel more accurately depict or articulates what we're connecting with when we do this work.
Nice. Some people ask me similar things. I say, well, the body is the objected or seemingly objective sense of an object. And embodiment, or this subjective, or body experience, is subjective, felt sense of the body, which may have much fuzzier edges and much deeper experience than you know might be obvious at first.
Yeah, I think that. So we're pointing in the same direction with those two descriptions, very much so. And I like that fuzziness.
Fuzzy edges. First time I said that, but yeah, something similar. Almost boundaryless. So embodiment is getting thrown around much more and just tagged on things, you know, as a sort of bit of a hashtag. So it's nice. I have a whole chapter in my first book on what is embodiment, as I got a bit annoyed with that, and got a YouTube video what embodiment isn't as well, which is just a slight rant, because I just got tired of it being thrown onto things. And the thing with meditation, right? So beginners have certain misunderstandings, like you have to say Om, or you have to sit in lotus position, or your mind's going to be empty. And I think most of our listeners, though, aren't complete beginners, even if they're martial arts people, dance people, and just a lot of people these days. They've done the mindfulness of breathing on the app. So what are some misunderstandings you come across from sort of people more like me, like intermediate practitioners who aren't, you know, teachers of 30 years, but aren't complete newbies either? What are some intermediate mistakes you seem to come across?
I think one of the big ones is, you know, to be blunt, is we're going to get it right.
Okay.
You know, and I think that this is maybe something that I see in beginning meditators, medium experienced meditators, much more experienced meditators, is a sense that there's something to get right here. There's a place to be, a state to achieve. And, you know, maybe this is reflective of how our human minds work. Maybe it's reflective of, you know, the consumer culture we live in, where you put down your buck and you get something. But meditation, while I think it can be understood to some extent in that way, you know, at the end of the day, that's not really what meditation's offering us. There's this Tibetan word. This is probably, Mark, one of the best meditation teachings I've ever been offered.
Okay, right. You said that nicely. We're all listening. Neil, what is it? What is it?
The Tibetan word for meditation is Gom, G-O-M, and it means to become familiar with.
Nice.
And I think that's something that beginners don't know. And those of us who have a little bit more experience forget all the time to become familiar with this human life.
Yeah, more poetically, I've heard that described as developing intimacy with the breath or the body.
Yeah, and Pema Chrodron, to come back to Pema Chrodron, she often talks about it as friendliness, which is also a great way of describing it.
I was teaching earlier a little group of meditation online. I said, look, don't examine your body like a tax inspector or, you know, someone looking at a parking ticket. Do you know what I mean? Like, that attitude is as important as the technique, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point, Mark. One of the things I do is I have classes here in Victoria that, you know, a couple of weekly classes that I've been doing for years. And one of the things that we've been exploring in those classes recently is the act of introducing our attention to the object of meditation, the act of introducing our attention to embodied experience. And we've been exploring just that, an attitude that facilitates the kind of curiosity and appreciation you see in becoming familiar with. And so we've been talking about, you know, meditation as kind of sitting down at a coffee shop with an old friend. You know, you don't do it like a tax collector. You sit down and you say, hey, Mark, how you doing? You're looking good, or you're looking a little bit tired, or what's going on in you? I haven't seen you for a long time. I'd really like to know more. That kind of attitude, I think, is, you know, what we're pointing to here.
There's a warmth and an involvement, isn't there? I sometimes say, like watching friends getting married, like really present and friendly and supportive, but not interfering.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
Feel free to take that one. And the one I use for Canadians is like a Canadian police officer watching two people fight, for when you're being present with less easy emotions.
Mm-hmm.
I heard there was a rule in Canada where you can have a fight as long as it's consensual. It's like an ice hockey. So that's when people say, yeah, but it's not friendly, it's not like a wedding, it's anger or something. I'm like, okay, that's the metaphor I use for that. Is a friendly Canadian police officer who's ready to step in, but won't unless they really have to.
So, yeah, I think that's a great description. That's a wonderful description. All of which, and, you know, all these ways that we've described, one of the things I love about all these kind of different ways of pointing in the same direction, one of the things they all have in common to my ear is, you know, a willingness and a capacity to allow our experience to unfold in the way it wants and needs to, which I think is really beautiful.
So, and allowing, right? Like
allowing.
Interference and allowing, that's part of this. Like, I think people are getting more sophisticated now. We used to say mindfulness is just paying attention. Now it's like, yeah, there's a few more elements to it, like this kindness, this intimacy, or this allowing, that are a little bit more than just like staring at something, you know? Yeah.
I think that's a great, there is an evolution that seems to be, you know, happening in our understanding of the practice. And I think it's happening because we're doing the practice. And so we are becoming more familiar and recognizing some terms that just don't quite resonate with what we find.
How are you finding it as a teacher now? Because I've had to sort of up my game, because 15 years ago, I could teach any old shit mindfulness breathing and people would be like, wow. But these days, the audiences are a lot more discerning. Are you finding that? Like, and I really, jokes aside, I celebrate it. There's a sophisticatedness to the average person coming to me, you know, and I'm like, wow, I better be good here, because there's a higher standard now out there.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, I think there's much more familiarity with the practice, both intellectually and experientially. People are much more willing to speak to and from their own experience with meditation now. And so how I feel as a teacher is I feel much more on the edge of my seat all the time, which is, on the one hand, it's terrifying. I mean, it's terrifying to be on the edge of my seat. On the other hand, I find it really exciting, because I find that as this has happened, my learning curve has gone way up. That, you know, it's not like what's happened is, you know, I've become more of an authority in the old style understanding of an authority. I've had to dig more deeply into my own experience and my own understanding, and that's revealed a lot to me. And to be much more willing to kind of hear what people are offering in terms of insights and instructions and questions they might be asking.
Yeah, I guess years ago when someone went to a teacher, the teacher was probably pretty sure they'd only studied that form of meditation. Whereas now
Yeah.
with the internet and travel, friends go to Thailand, India, whatever, it's so much more. And I also find it a little scary, but really interesting. And it makes me up my game. So
Yeah.
what about this tension between, you say there's nothing to get right, but there is a technique,
There
right?
is.
So how do you balance that tension between you can't get it wrong, but you can sort of do the technique wrong?
Well, I mean, again, that's a really interesting question. And one of the things that I've been working on lately, with people I'm engaging, is beginning to offer something in addition to a focus on technique. So we do focus on technique. I want to be clear, that's not gone, but we're adding something more to the pot, if you will. And that is a heightened sense of how the process of meditation works, kind of empowering people to see and understand the process that underlay a particular technique, so that when they're engaging a technique, they can see and feel and know when it's appropriate to stay with the technique and when it's appropriate to maybe do something a little bit different. Right. Because there are times when it's not appropriate to stay with the technique. There are times when it's appropriate to do something a little bit different. And where the needs and imperatives of your embodied experience are calling you in that direction. And this increased focus, or this slightly increased focus on the process of meditation, I'm finding is, empowering people to be able to make that discernment. Okay, stay with technique right now, or do something a little bit different.
I find this interesting. Like, again, as meditation audiences become more sophisticated, this fluidity, I think all practitioners just do it themselves anyway as they get around for a while, right? Because I was making a joke today, like the meditation police aren't watching what's going on in your head, don't worry, and it seems to happen organically. Like, people start out, and it used to be like sit down, do this technique, it's Gwenka, it's 10 days, this is the only thing we're going to do. And then people just don't really do that. So but on the other hand, how is it, like, is there a risk of sort of just being undisciplined and jumping around and not really digging a deep well, like even within one sit or over a period of a year where, I was meditating with you guys, and then 2 weeks later with Shinzen Young, and then 2 weeks later somewhere else, and it's like I was sort of shopping for meditation teachers at that point when I met you. Well, there's kind of risks in the short term of the actual individual sit, and in the longer term of choosing a teacher or a practice or a lineage, right?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a risk in this situation. The other side of that coin, however, is there's also a risk in being, I'm going to use the word rigid, which makes it sound, kind of authoritarian and oppressive. And that's not really how I mean it. I'm meaning it in simply a descriptive way. Being really firm, there's a risk in being really firm and rigid about technique as well. And one of the risks there is, as you noted, people end up doing what they do anyway. And what I found is, without the acknowledgement of, okay, sometimes we do need to veer away from the formal technique. Here's what those times might be. Here's what those veerings might look like. Without those acknowledgements, people kind of doing what they do while being given instructions anyway. There's a shadow that forms there. A lot of people feel bad or guilty, or like they're doing something wrong, and that there's something about their experience that needs to be hidden and not acknowledged in this meditative context. And that's really, I think, the shadow that I'm trying to address. And maybe it'll go too far in this one direction, and then we'll kind of swing back a little bit. So I think there's risks in both directions. And so, we just experiment and modulate and see if we can touch that mythical and elusive perfect still spot point in the middle once every 10 years, right?
And it strikes me that something new is happening. Well, meditation schools have always cross-fertilized, and they've talk about universities in India that had, Mahayana and Theravada in the same university. There's always been some degree of that, but the innovation, the sort of postmodern complexity, the ease of travel and of the internet, this is a new cocktail that's being stirred up that hasn't really been served up before, I don't think. And I'm very curious where that goes.
I am too, and I mean it's wide open as far as I'm concerned. Meaning that I have no idea where it's going to go, but I definitely noticed that phenomenon.
I appreciate. It's so. I also have I don't know, right? Like, no one does.
I mean, like you said, it's fairly unusual to be able for you to go and do 2 weeks with this community and 2 weeks with that community and then 2 weeks with another community. And it goes further than that. We could sit here for an hour and move around the internet and find countless different approaches to meditation presented by very capable and articulate teachers.
Right. I just saw one talk from the Embodiment conference that was a year ago, and I just hadn't caught up with this one teacher, and it was like, this is brilliant, and I almost missed it, and God, there's another 48 in this category I haven't seen yet, and do you know what I mean? Like, how do I choose? And pros and cons like anything, but it's heavy. And then on top of that, technology coming in, right? Not just to deliver, but now technology. I saw a device. Now, I've used brainwave kind of sensing for a while, but this one was actually zapping your brain. This was
really
passive. And it was advertised on Facebook. And I was like, okay, this is a commercially available, meditation zapping device. Do you know what I'm saying? It's active, not passive.
Yeah.
It's reading. It's not just feedback, it's doing something. And I was just like, okay, we're in a whole new territory now. This is coming out.
That's very interesting. I hadn't heard of that. I'd known about the more receptive sort of devices, but zapping, that's new. Meditative zapping, you may have coined a phrase there.
I know Shinzen was working on the enlightenment cap, and some risky things involved, but seems to be coming through. All right.
You raise an interesting point in those comments, that I think I want to follow up on. And, that is the point, the question of, is there a point at which it's appropriate for us to choose? You've talked about shopping. Yes. I think that's a really important part of our meditative journey. And then, is there a point at which we actually make a choice to go relatively deep with a particular practice, a particular tradition, a particular teacher? And I think that the dynamics of the situation that you're articulating have really changed that equation as well, because it's easier to go relatively deep with people all over the world right now. And because relatively deep, maybe it's not going to last for 20 years because there's going to be a wobble in the sense that, okay, I need to go somewhere else, and you're able to actually do that.
Right. I mean, it's like we've gone from an era where everyone had to get married and you couldn't get divorced to an era where everyone's on meditation Tinder. And you know what I mean? And like, it's like, but I'm a big believer in marriage after having at least dated a bit, That's, you get the analogy, right? Like date, then get married, and don't just get divorced because you've had your first argument.
No, I'm very much the same. I'm all, and for both of them, for the dating and the marriage piece, date, look around, check out meditative Tinder, as you put it. Great phrase. Once again, Mark, you're coming up with lots today.
I got away with words.
Meditative Tinder. And then when something feels, and what's the rubric for choosing? I mean, I often say, is it good enough? It doesn't need to be perfect, but does the situation resonate? Do the practices and the teachings resonate for you? And does the situation as a whole feel good enough? Great, go for it.
We'll call this episode Meditation Tinder for sure. But the other piece I think has happened is there's been a lot of sort of scandals, abuse cases, and you feel free to talk about as much or as little as you're comfortable with in your own kind of background. People have got quite disillusioned with teachers, haven't they, and lineages of not just one kind. I don't want to pick on anyone, because it's Zen, it's Tibetan, it's this, it's that, it's Western, it's Eastern. And that's also created this difficulty with kind of getting married, as it were, right? And it's because it has to be good enough effectiveness, but also ethically.
Yes.
And both of those things are in question, I think, a lot of the time now.
Yeah. And, appropriately so, given some of the things that have been coming out. And years and years ago, I remember a Tibetan teacher, Trangu Rinpoche. I read a talk where he was, speaking to the matter of choosing to work with a teacher. And he was really advocating moving slowly. He said, take your time, really check the situation out, look at the teacher, look at the teachings, look at the practices, look at the senior students, look at the community. And, I think that kind of buyer beware caution is extremely wise. And I'm not sure, in my own experience, I'm not sure that kind of caution and attentiveness and due diligence was encouraged in the past. And maybe we're now coming into an era where those kind of warnings are going to come more to the fore. Like, okay, it feels good enough. Like, let's check it out a little bit longer. Let's, ask some students, ask some former students. Let's look into this situation to really discern whether this is a good enough situation for me. So maybe the rubric of good enough is a measure that's reached a number of times before we actually jump in.
I think it gets a little different over time as well. Like, we're both quite experienced in different things. Like, for example, I have red flags now. I'll give you one example. Like, I went to an Aikido school in San Francisco, and there's a very senior Aikido teacher, and there was a load of white belts and brown belts, but there was no other black belts. And that was weird because this guy was very senior. But then the black belts didn't stick around because the guy, I think, turned out was a bit abusive or unpleasant somehow. So people only ever sort of got their black belt and then just left. Normally in a school with a sort of 6th dan, you'll also see a couple of 4th dans, quite a few 3rd and 2nd dans, and there was none. And I remember thinking, that's off. And then I felt, and I went, oh, that's off in my body. And then I was training with someone, and they just kind of wrenched my wrist a little bit harder than necessary, like 10% harder than was really needed. And I went, that's off too. And then it was like flag, never went back there, even though everyone knows about this teacher. And then a few years later, I hear, this teacher's abusive this way, that way. But I think you get better at that, but it also becomes a little bit harder. Like, a second marriage ain't quite the same as a first marriage.
No, that's true.
Something about a second marriage, or I haven't never had that. This is an analogy. I haven't done that in real life. But it's different, isn't it, when you've been around a little bit?
Yeah. And, here we kind of veer into my own, personal experience. It's been about almost 2 years since, my relationship with the Dharma Ocean community unraveled and I left. And, I'd worked with the Shambhala community beforehand. And so maybe this is a third marriage, or, I'm in the 3rd marriage stage. But I find myself extremely cautious, and maybe it's because it's early days for me. It's only been a couple years, not even. But I find myself extremely cautious, which may be appropriate at this stage. But I do ask myself the question, okay, what might it be to enter into another relationship at some point in the future? What might that look like? How might it be different from what's happened in the past, given the fact that I've now got 30 years of, solid training experience under my belt? Will it look more like a mentorship relationship, where the assistance is sought out in a more episodic fashion? Or will it look like the more ongoing apprenticeship thing that I've done before? I mean, it is different.
Divorcees out there. I was an Aikido divorcee, was the practice rather than a teacher for a while. And it can create a bitterness or a cynicism, or just, as you said, hypervigilance. And as you say, maybe it's about timing as well. You need to sort of be on your own for a few years, date for a few years. There can be a bit of a cycle with this. And then, can the teacher handle it? Like, when I go to a new martial arts club, some of them expect me to be like a complete beginner, whereas others, they're like, look, I really want to acknowledge that you've got your black belt, you've done a couple of martial arts, and what we do here is a bit different, so try and be open-minded. And there's some of them can handle that, I notice, and some of them can't, and I have to sort of almost pretend to be naive.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Can a new teacher, teacher new to you, actually embrace the history and the experience that you bring to the situation?
Increasingly, I have students that are really quite competent. So I'm sort of like, that's for me as a teacher as well. I'm like, okay, how do we incorporate the fact this guy's a Systema instructor, or this woman's done a practice for 20 years I've never heard of? Well, how do we incorporate that, rather than just go, well, yeah, you're the same as everyone else.
Yeah. And I think if we can find ways to incorporate it, it really enriches the situation, because there's going to be this depth of experience and perspective and understanding and insight, and, kind of a fresh take outside whatever the modality that I'm working in that's going to be brought into the situation. Yeah, I think it can be really exciting.
I kind of want to step back because we skipped over something that I think is critical and not as obvious as it looks, which is why bother doing any of this? Like, what is meditation? We looked at what is embodiment, but like, you sent me this question ahead of time, like, why meditate? I've been thinking about it. Like, different people would answer that different ways. So, some people seeking enlightenment, some people just trying to calm down a little bit, deal with their stress. Like, why meditate? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that I actually ask myself every day. I think I asked myself that question with some regularity before, COVID and everything else hit, a couple of years ago. But certainly throughout the span of this recent stretch, it's become something that I ask myself every day, every day. Why meditate? There are people suffering in the world. There are people struggling in the world. I'm struggling in the world. So why do it? Why sit down, lie down, and give, 30, 45, 60 minutes of my day to this practice? And one of the things that is really interesting about this question is I don't know that there's a definitive answer. Actually, I'm sure there isn't a definitive answer, which I love. I think asking this question has made me much more open to the varying motivations people bring to, the classes, the workshops, the online things, whatever it is that I'm offering. There's no definitive answer, but it remains worth asking and seeing what's there today. And today the answer is, I meditate because in coming back to embodiment, in developing a familiarity and a relationship with embodied experience, I access fundamental human qualities like clarity and sensitivity and responsiveness that are really helpful in my everyday life. So that would be the answer today. Right. Tomorrow it will likely be something different.
And I also hear you say it's kind of a fruitful inquiry, whatever, to be purposeful, to really ask, does it align with my values? There's almost a default now with some students who come to me, which is like, oh, it's a stress management and productivity tool, right? And I'm like, well, you could use it for that, but I don't think that was really what it was intended for originally. And also there's a bunch of other stuff that might be richer, but also for me on different days, I was on holiday in a spa hotel last week. I didn't need any relaxation.
Yeah.
2 hours in the sauna and the swimming pool every day. So it's today.
And if you ask me tomorrow my stress level is through the roof, I might answer differently. Rather than pointing to the qualities that I connect with, I'd point to the fact, well, when I come back to embodied experience, my suffering, which is the traditional terminology for stress, tension, anxiety, my suffering decreases, it lessens. And that's why I do it today, now that I'm really stressed out. So yeah, it does change from day to day.
It makes me laugh that we've sort of rebranded suffering as these sort of relatively benign sounding words, like I'm not suffering, I'm just stressed. I'm like, that is suffering, motherfucker. Like, well, come on. Like
Well, the thing of it is, I've been teaching for probably about 15 years, and I do a lot of, I've done a lot of instruction with beginners over that span of time. And one of the things I've noticed in this span is suffering, that word kind of goes over like a lead balloon. I'll be sitting in a room with people. We've been doing this 6-week introductory series. People are on board, they're interested, they're engaged. And then I use the S word and it's like,
something about modern culture doesn't want to acknowledge. It's the sort of forced smile of, you know, particularly North American culture. I would say in Canada and the US, it's quite hard. You know, people, either everything's great and let's smile, right? Like, and, you know, down to the sort of macho guy says, I'm fine, you know, I'm good, you know, I'm all right.
Yeah.
You know, on multiple levels, it's kind of denied, I think, in our kind of cultural context. And it's a little bit, if you imagine India, kind of, you know, walking over dead bodies on your way to lunch, it's a little bit harder to deny, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely a cultural element. So what I end up doing is I acknowledge the suffering term. I acknowledge that traditional term, and then I talk in terms that seem to have more modern resonance, which would be stress, tension, anxiety, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you've mentioned daily life a couple of times, like right at the beginning and just now. Like, seems like that's sometimes missing from some teachers, like the rest of their life. As most of us, I meditate, you know, half an hour on a good day, you know, and if I'm on retreat, maybe it's more, but that's only once or twice a year. So, like, the rest of my life is what I'm most interested in. I'm not a monastic yet. I guess maybe we've inherited quite a few monastic traditions where there was no rest of your life.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I've been thinking about this a lot. I think it's reflected in, you know, kind of the pedagogy, the teaching methods that we see with, you know, so much meditation instruction. And I think there's a lot to be said for what we've inherited, or what I've inherited and what I've experienced in the past in a variety of different contexts, not just one context. But there does seem to be this teaching model where I go somewhere, I receive a teaching from the teacher, and then I go home.
Yeah.
And what that model does is it completely ignores the stuff of my everyday life. I mean, how am I supposed to integrate this into my life? Does it just happen? Is there an advanced course that I can take? You know, what's the deal? And one of the things I've been wondering about is, you know, can we change the pedagogy? Can we change our teaching methods so that we actually have models that offer some scaffolding for going into our lives and beginning to see this stuff alive in our relationships and our work and our dirty dishes and our, you know, after hours soccer games or football games, if you will.
And then the Zoom technology and the rest of it can help, I think, with this, right? In terms of integration, it's quite different. Like, I've done a couple of home retreats now online. You know, it's quite different because you're in your life. You're not. When I went and trained with you, it's just beautiful retreats into the Colorado mountains, surrounded by snow. Well, it couldn't have been more beautiful, but it couldn't have been more different than the rest of my life.
Yeah. And it's one of the things I think that's lovely about, you know, the Zoom context. I love when a class comes together online and I get to see all the backgrounds, because I'm seeing people's lives and connecting with people's lives in a way that I never have before. I've never had the opportunity to do that before. And it reminds me that there is a link to be made here. As a teacher, it reminds me that, okay, there's a link to be made here. You know, we're talking about this particular teaching right now, but how are these people going to understand it in their own lives? How are they going to see it in their own lives? And how are they going to apply it or cultivate it or develop it in their own lives?
It's true, actually. Like, normally students would come to a course, and now I know all my students' cats now. I know half their kids. A bunch of their husbands and wives will pop in and we'll see them on the screen, and they'll be like, "Oh, bye, darling, have a good day at work." I'm like, "Oh, that's the husband. How's it going to work?" Okay. You know, I can see, like, thinking of one student of mine, Ireland, that lives in this really, like, dark, cozy house, and another one's this big New York apartment with high ceilings. You know, I'm getting their context now.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we do, so if we come together as a group, and we're going to start practicing, there's a little bell I ring when we begin to practice, and the bell sounds when we're all ready to practice. So as everyone's settling, I'm waiting. It's not like I'm going to decide we're doing it now. I wait for the group to settle. And one day, you know, I was waiting for this to ring the little bell, and I was like, why am I waiting? everyone, I can see all the screens are turned off, or everyone's sitting up, or everyone's laying down, everyone's ready, and I'm waiting. And I realized that one of the people had a dog that was still settling, and I was waiting for the dog to settle. And I just loved that, because, that was so communicative of what we're talking about, how this technology that, can be understood as, distant and cold, is actually simultaneously very connective and alive and warm. And so, now it's really delightful for me to, when we come together and sit, and, I wait for the cats and dogs to come to rest as well. And then we're ready to begin.
Pets win points in my Zoom calls.
Yeah.
We always, someone held their baby up this morning in the call. And I was talking about, okay, this is a meditation technique you can adapt to when you're holding a baby, because you can still move doing this technique. And I wouldn't have done that as a teacher had I not saw with the baby. And of course, everyone sort of softened and cooed, and it was quite helpful for the training as well. But it was like seeing her context make you go, oh yeah, I don't have a baby, so I don't think about that. But this technique, here's the adaptation for you. And she really smiled, because she was like, great, something I can do with my baby.
And I love that. I mean, I still think there's a place for beautiful, quiet shrine rooms that let us step out of our lives for a day, a weekend, a week, whatever it is that they afford us the opportunity to do, to really focus and go deep with the practice in and of itself. And I absolutely love that we have this emergent technology where we're meeting in this way and becoming familiar with one another in this way. And slowly beginning to acknowledge that missing piece, in my opinion, that missing piece of the puzzle is, okay, you've received the teaching. Now, what about your life?
Boom. And spa hotels with good Wi-Fi are a pretty good substitute for meditation centers with bad food. They've got room service, you've got nice air conditioning. It's perfect. So,
all right, I never thought of that. That's a great idea. Okay, I'm going to do this Zoom retreat.
At a spa hotel with room service. Trust me, it's not totally conducive, but it's pleasant. Buddha nature. This was on the things you sent me ahead of time. And I thought, do I want to ask him about this? It's a bit hippie sounding, a bit Buddhisty, religious-y, but go on. We've got a few minutes. So what is Buddha nature?
Buddha nature. So again, the last couple of years have been really difficult for myself, as is the case with so many other people. Excuse me. And I've been asking myself these basic questions over and over again. Why meditate? What is embodiment? We've touched on those. And then the other one that I've been asking is, what if Buddha nature is true? Excuse me. So Buddha nature is a Buddhist teaching, and it points to this sense that there are certain qualities that are innate in us as human beings, that are fundamental in us as human beings. They are there if you have long hair, short hair, dark hair, light hair, if you're tall, not so tall, make lots of money, not so much money, if you're having a good day, a bad day. These qualities are present in our experience. And I've already mentioned them using the words clarity. We have an innate capacity to see a situation for what it is. Sensitivity. We have an innate capacity to feel the experience of others as our own. No boundaries. And responsiveness, we have an innate capacity to come into the world based on this clarity and sensitivity. That's what Buddha nature points to. So sometimes the phrase that's used is basic goodness, but Buddha nature. So what if Buddha nature is true? And this, we touched upon this a few minutes ago. This really kind of points to some interesting things in the student and teacher relationship, particularly. If Buddha nature is true, it really kind of alters the playing field, the uneven playing field between student and teacher, in my opinion. Meaning, sure, the teacher may still be the expert on this particular tradition and this particular technique, and I do believe there remains a role for experts in this work. So the teacher may have a certain wealth of experience and understanding that the student may or may not. But the teacher does not corner the market on Buddha nature. The teacher is not the only person in the room who sees clearly and who knows sensitively and who is able to come into this world in a way that's aligned with these things. And one of the things that I think about the teaching contexts that I'm in is, how can we affirm that fact? How can I affirm that fact? How can I help others begin to honor and respect and embody their own deep, innate knowing about life, the universe, and everything? And as a result, learn and grow and be enriched myself, because I'm receiving wisdom from this person who's asking a very basic question, but pointing to something really important for all of us to know and understand in this particular moment. So what if the Buddha nature is true? What if we all have these qualities? How does that affect our teaching situations and the student-teacher relationship and that dynamic? And I suspect, if we can really embrace and celebrate that, we might just see a little bit less of these problematic situations that have arisen that you point to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not neutral, is it? Our models, is it revealing enlightenment or is it attaining enlightenment? Is it enlightenment sort of passed as lineage between transmitted? These are not neutral models as to the sort of power relations and the sort of context and abuse that might happen as a result.
Yeah. And so let's bring Buddha nature into the mix. Wow. Okay. You're learning from me. And because of these basic qualities, you have something to show me that I better pay attention to.
Okay. Last question before we wrap up. Roger Federer, what was that about?
Roger Federer. So, you asked me to submit a couple of talking points just to see if we, might want to touch on them in the course of this hour. And we've touched on a few. And one of them was Roger Federer. Roger Federer, I believe that awe and beauty and grace and mystery are essential aspects of our embodied lives. And that's a telling phrase, our embodied lives. These are not intellectual experiences. They are visceral, embodied experience. The experience of awe, the experience of mystery is an embodied experience. And part of, I think, our task and responsibility and opportunity as practitioners, specifically, but as human beings more generally, is to acknowledge and honor and respect these whenever and however they show up in our lives. And for me, Roger Federer is a manifestation of grace. When I watch him do a leaping forehand or a one-hand backhand where his whole heart opens up and then time seems to stop as he reaches the end of the stroke, I feel like I'm in awe at the beauty of it all. And it's not going to show up that way, obviously, for everyone, but I feel like that's part of our task as practitioners and humans, again, is to recognize where that shows up for us and to actually honor and embrace it in an embodied way. Celebrate it that way.
Beautiful, beautiful. You heard it here, kids. If you meditate, you'll be as rich and famous and good looking as Roger Federer, pretty sure. But,
that would be great to put on a brochure. So Roger, if you're listening to this, please send me the permission and I'll put it on my website.
I do get what you mean about grace. I like watching sports I don't care about at the Olympics because I can focus on the grace and not be too involved in the actual sport.
Yeah.
Like, when the Olympics comes on, you're like, oh, Winter Olympics. I'm like, I don't know what this is, but I'm going to watch it because it's pretty.
Beautiful, beautiful.
All right, Neil, where do people find you online? I know on your website, there's actually, you've got Zoom courses, nicely laid out website. Where do people go?
Well, the website's the main way, but I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Insight Timer. There are all the usual podcast outlets, but the website, kind of collects everything in one place. The website is neilmckinlay.com, and I am one of those rare McKinleys whose name ends with L-A-Y, not L-E-Y. You'll end up in something quite different if you look up an L-E-Y. But
MC, not Mac, right? Mook.
It's MC, it's Mook, McKinlay. And there you'll find connections to pretty much everything I'm doing, from guided meditations to writings to my Bringing Meditation to Life podcast to the 2 online communities that I host for people who are interested in this work.
Oh, I didn't know you had a podcast, and on the Instagram too, down with the kids. It's all there. It's really nicely laid out, your website. Actually, I encourage people to go have a look at that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yes, I have a podcast, Bringing Meditation to Life, which of course is speaking to what we've been speaking to for much of the last hour.
Well, I've enjoyed this, Neil. Do you have a closing message about the body to see us out?
Yeah, it doesn't take much. It just takes a little bit of effort and a little bit of time. And 5 seconds in the grocery store, standing in the lineup, turning our attention toward embodied experience, settling in, receiving what's there, that can be considered a practice. And I think with so many of us living such busy lives, acknowledging, honoring, and respecting that is important. So please do.
Neil McKinlay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.